In the dusty corridors of Djibouti, where the Red Sea wind carries whispers of empire and resistance, tension hung like smoke. Inside the towering glass of the African Union's temporary headquarters, the air was heavy, not just with heat but with suspicion. Mahamoud Ali Youssouf stood at the center of it all. A veteran diplomat, a visionary who spoke softly but moved with thunder. He had promised Africa something radical: unity without puppetry, sovereignty without compromise. But not everyone celebrated his rise. Within boardrooms and behind embassy walls, old powers stirred. They saw him not as a unifier, but as a threat to centuries of quiet control. What they didn't realize was that Youssouf had already seen them coming. This is the story of one man's stand against betrayal, and how, in facing it, he lit a fire across a continent desperate to reclaim its soul. For generations, the Horn of Africa had served as a prized gateway, not just for trade, but for control. Colonial powers built railroads not for people, but for plunder. Ports like Djibouti became chess pieces in imperial hands, and even after independence, the chains were merely redesigned. Foreign military bases remained, dressed in the language of security and cooperation. Economic policies were dictated from far-off capitals. The African Union, created as a symbol of unity and resistance, slowly drifted into compromise, managed by cautious technocrats, manipulated by subtle foreign hands. Amid this backdrop emerged Mahamoud Ali Youssouf, a man shaped by diplomacy but driven by fire. Known across African capitals for his calm intelligence, Youssouf had grown tired of watching his continent bow to outsiders. He began to speak openly about a different vision, an African Union that was not just a table for discussion, but a shield of sovereignty. He called for the removal of foreign military bases, for the control of African resources by Africans, and for unity that was more than ceremony. His words struck a chord with the continent's restless youth and reform-minded leaders who were tired of begging for respect. But power does not yield quietly. Behind closed doors, resistance began to fester. Elite figures within the AU, men and women tied to lucrative contracts and foreign favors, whispered that Youssouf was a threat. They feared not instability, but accountability. To them, his rise marked the end of quiet deals and blind loyalty to old empires. Foreign agents took note as well. One reforming diplomat was suddenly seen as the fuse to something far bigger, a continental shift that could rewrite Africa's future. And so, quietly, they began to prepare. Not for debate, but for removal. The plan didn't start with a gun or a grenade. It began with whispers. In quiet corners of Addis Ababa, Nairobi, and Paris, powerful men gathered away from cameras and protocols. They were a mix of hardened AU bureaucrats clinging to old privileges, ex-generals with decades of blood and debt behind them, and foreign operatives hidden beneath the smooth skin of diplomats and consultants. Their meetings were discreet, but the stakes were massive. Mahamoud Ali Youssouf had started doing what no one dared, asking why Africa remained a continent full of foreign military bases, yet still helpless in its own crises. He questioned trade agreements, port deals, and resource contracts that bled the continent while enriching outsiders, and worst of all, he was rallying others to do the same. For those in power, Youssouf wasn't just a reformer. He was a fire that could spread. They feared that if he succeeded in shifting the balance of power within the African Union, the whole ecosystem of foreign control would begin to crumble. The Horn of Africa, with its strategic location on the Red Sea, was the artery through which global trade pulsed. Djibouti's ports, guarded by foreign troops, had become gateways for wealth, but not for Africans. With Youssouf pushing for transparency and sovereignty, foreign stakeholders panicked. They saw future losses in billions. Elites inside the AU felt their influence shrinking. No more secret handshakes, no more quiet bribes, no more hiding behind vague development partnerships. Their fear turned into a shared goal. Youssouf had to be neutralized. At first, they tried soft tactics, character assassination through planted rumors, allegations of extremism, stories of disloyalty. But Youssouf didn't falter. He moved calmly, continued building alliances across the continent, and gained the trust of younger, rising leaders. Next came isolation, attempts to fracture his support within the AU by turning countries against him. That, too, failed. His message had already taken root. Desperation grew, and then, in a dimly lit room in Nairobi, someone finally said what others were thinking. "He won't stop unless we stop him." The suggestion wasn't shouted, it was breathed, like a curse. The others listened. There would be no formal resolution, just a shared understanding. A plot was born. The timing would be key. During his upcoming peace delegation in a volatile region, an ambush would be staged. It would be blamed on a known terrorist group, the perfect smokescreen. The world would mourn publicly while key AU officials pushed for a transition council to preserve stability. In return, promises flowed. Riches, promotions, safe havens in foreign capitals. They believed it would be surgical, clean, the kind of thing Africa had seen before and forgotten just as easily. But in their arrogance, they made one mistake. They assumed Youssouf didn't know. They assumed wrong, because while they plotted in darkness, he was already watching and waiting. The timing was chosen with surgical precision, not in chaos but in calm. Mahamoud Ali Youssouf was scheduled to attend a high-profile African Union Economic Forum in Nairobi, a gathering meant to showcase Africa's self-reliance and regional integration. Delegates from across the continent were preparing speeches about trade corridors, digital currencies, and Pan-African infrastructure. But behind the curtain of unity and progress, a different script was being rehearsed. The conspirators had waited patiently, and now they saw their opportunity. Nairobi, bustling and loud, provided the perfect storm: media attention, symbolic weight, and logistical vulnerability. The plan was to stage an attack during Youssouf's transit from his hotel to the summit venue, a narrow road, predictable and unprotected by military escort. A stolen car packed with explosives would do the job. The device would be remotely triggered, timed precisely as his convoy passed a construction detour near a bridge. The official narrative had already been prepared. Within minutes of the blast, pre-written statements would flood social media and news wires. Tragic attack by insurgents. Regional instability threatens progress. The AU mourns a visionary. Names of a known terrorist group would be inserted, along with doctored videos and eyewitnesses claiming they saw masked men fleeing. The goal was to create chaos but not suspicion, to grieve Youssouf's death but not investigate it. His seat at the AU would be quietly filled by one of the insiders, a man seen as moderate, someone who smiled easily at foreign delegations and never questioned military partnerships. Behind the scenes, the rewards had already been divided like spoils of war. The AU bureaucrats involved in the plot were promised elevated posts, commissioner roles, special envoys, full immunity from audit. The generals were offered fresh arms contracts through private Western firms, payment laundered through development assistance programs. For the foreign operatives orchestrating the logistics, the payoff was strategic: the death of a Pan-African threat and the restoration of a controllable status quo. And for the conspirators with families, quiet arrangements had been made. Asylum paperwork filed in Europe and the Gulf, bank accounts opened under shell names in Geneva and Dubai. Everyone had something to gain. Everyone believed it would work. Youssouf would be remembered in warm speeches, his face on AU banners, his quotes recycled in hollow ceremonies. But his vision of an African Union without foreign strings would die with him. What they didn't count on was that Youssouf's inner circle had already detected inconsistencies. A junior security officer reassigned without explanation, a sudden shift in convoy route, an unvetted diplomat requesting a seat at the summit. Whispers reached loyal ears. Phone records were traced. A last-minute decision was made. Youssouf would proceed as if nothing had changed, but his team would change everything. And so the car waited, and so the trigger man prepared. But when the motorcade turned that final corner, it wasn't Youssouf inside the lead vehicle. It was a decoy, and the real war had just begun. Mahamoud Ali Youssouf was no stranger to danger, but this time the silence around him had a different weight. It began with a whisper, passed quietly during a routine diplomatic briefing. A trusted informant, an old friend from his early days in the foreign ministry, leaned close and said just one line. "They're planning to take you out." Not politically, physically. That moment changed everything. Youssouf didn't panic. He didn't retreat. Instead, he did what true leaders do. He listened, he thought, and then he acted. He began to trace the shadows. Surveillance teams close to him quietly cross-referenced communications, flight records, and hotel bookings. Patterns emerged, meetings between supposed AU delegates and known foreign consultants with military ties, unusual money transfers, and sudden requests for changes in security protocols. The noose wasn't just around him, it was tightening across the African Union. Rather than expose the threat immediately, Youssouf made a bold decision, to let the plot deepen. He crafted an illusion of routine, of vulnerability. His schedule remained unchanged. His travel plan to Nairobi stood. But behind the scenes, he summoned patriots, not politicians but defenders of Africa's soul. Young intelligence officers from Senegal, cyber trackers from Kenya, loyal diplomats from Eritrea and Chad, each one hand-picked, each one committed to the dream of a free, united Africa. They met in coded calls, encrypted chats, midnight hotel rooms. Together, they built a web, one that looked fragile from the outside, but was made of steel on the inside. Youssouf's team monitored the conspirators day and night. They bugged rooms, intercepted messages, and documented every move, collecting proof, not assumptions. And when the assassination date neared, Youssouf gave the order, "Let them come. But this time, we'll be watching." A decoy vehicle was prepared, manned by special forces disguised as staff. Surveillance drones were hidden in street lamps. Internal AU communication channels were quietly tapped. Every conspirator was tracked in real time. The goal wasn't just to stop the plot, it was to expose it. Youssouf didn't want silence. He wanted the world to see exactly who had tried to sell Africa's future. And when the trap was finally sprung, it wouldn't be with a bang, but with the quiet snap of handcuffs behind closed doors. The hunter was now the hunted. The night fell heavy over Nairobi like a curtain soaked in oil, dark, suffocating, still. The streets around the African Union Summit venue were quiet, too quiet. No shouting vendors, no traffic chaos. Just the dull hum of air conditioners and distant city lights flickering like nervous heartbeats. Inside the summit complex, marble floors echoed with the soft shuffle of diplomatic shoes and muffled conversations. But beneath the polished civility, tension crackled like dry leaves ready to burn. Conspirators whispered final instructions into burner phones. Messages were sent, short, sharp, untraceable. A small weapons cache had been quietly delivered 2 hours earlier and placed in a service van marked Media Equipment. The trap was set. In their minds, the endgame had begun. Mahamoud Ali Youssouf's convoy would arrive in less than an hour. The trigger was in position. The patsy, an alleged rebel agent already drugged and dressed, was ready to take the blame posthumously. All that remained was timing, but something was off. One of the generals, old, ruthless, confident, felt it in his bones. A silence too perfect. A protocol officer who suddenly avoided eye contact. A guard who looked a little too alert. Still, they pushed forward. Arrogance, after all, was their greatest comfort. In the security control room, a technician inserted a flash drive containing a virus that would disable cameras for 5 crucial minutes. Or so he thought. What he didn't know was that the drive had been swapped, and every keystroke was being mirrored on another screen in a sealed room deep beneath the venue, where Youssouf's loyal operatives watched, recorded, and waited. At exactly 2100 hours, the decoy convoy approached. From a rooftop across the street, a sniper in a civilian jacket aimed through a scope, unaware that 2 Kenyan Special Forces agents had him in their own sights. As soon as his finger tightened, a sharp buzz echoed in his earpiece. Not a command, but static. His eyes widened. A second later, a cold metal muzzle touched the back of his neck. "Drop it," whispered a voice. Simultaneously, throughout the complex, doors burst open. Not with chaos, but with precision. Conspirators froze as black-clad operatives emerged from stairwells, bathrooms, side exits, nowhere and everywhere. Handcuffs clicked. Phones were seized. Documents were confiscated. No alarms sounded. No shots fired. Inside the main summit hall, Youssouf appeared, not flanked by aides, but standing alone. Calm. His presence silenced the room. Those who had plotted his death stared at him in disbelief, their mouths dry, their schemes shattered. One AU commissioner tried to stand, to protest, but his knees gave out. Another attempted to delete files on his tablet, only to find the screen had already gone black. Remotely disabled. The traitors weren't just caught, they were exposed. By midnight, they were gone, escorted out through service tunnels under heavy guard. Outside, Nairobi slept on, unaware of the storm that had just passed. Inside, the Union hadn't broken, it had awakened. Youssouf didn't gloat. He simply turned to his team and said, "Begin the announcements. Africa deserves to know." What followed the arrests was not just an investigation, it was an unmasking. Within hours of the betrayal being crushed, Youssouf's loyal intelligence team began combing through seized devices, briefcases, and confidential files. What they uncovered shook the very pillars of the African Union. Hidden within encrypted hard drives and burner phones were bank transfers. Millions of dollars moved quietly through offshore accounts and routed through development aid from embassies in Paris, Washington, and even a quiet Nordic capital known for neutrality. The origin of the funds was cloaked behind layers of shell companies and charity fronts. But the trail was clear. This coup had foreign fingerprints all over it. Among the most damning discoveries were a series of non-governmental organizations operating across East and West Africa, each claiming to promote education, climate resilience, or health, but their staff lists included former military intelligence officers. Their offices shared fax lines with foreign embassies, and in locked drawers and cloud servers, operatives found blueprints. Not for schools or clinics, but for surveillance centers, drone launch pads, and private security training sites. These were not NGOs, they were masks. And behind them were governments, corporations, and intelligence agencies who feared the very thing Youssouf represented: a sovereign, united Africa. The scope of the plot expanded by the hour. Communications showed coordination not just among traitorous AU officials, but among global energy firms, arms dealers, and select media outlets already briefed on how to report the assassination as a terrorist attack. Some Australian staff had been bribed with job offers in Geneva and Brussels, others with property deeds in Morocco, Ghana, and Dubai. What they had tried to stop was not just Youssouf as a man, but Youssouf as a symbol. His dream of shifting the AU from a ceremonial body to a real center of African decision-making had terrified them all. Perhaps most chilling was a single document marked Strategic Contingency Plan, AU Realignment. It detailed a step-by-step guide to restructuring the African Union post-Youssouf's death, appointing interim leaders, revising charters, and reintroducing regional stabilization partnerships that would reopen Africa to foreign military installations and debt-based economic control. It was not just a plot to kill a leader. It was a roadmap to recolonization. Youssouf, standing in a sealed intelligence chamber with his top aides, looked at the piles of evidence before him. Photos of supposed humanitarian workers loading crates of satellite equipment. Emails from consultants outlining which African nations to pressure next. Bank statements with amounts so large they no longer looked like money but weapons. He turned to his team and said, with quiet resolve, "This wasn't about me. It was about Africa itself. And they were ready to sell her soul. Now the world would have to watch, not as silent observers but as exposed conspirators." The truth was no longer hidden. It was raw, undeniable, and explosive, and it would soon be shown to every African screen, radio, and heart. The following morning, the doors to the African Union building opened with a sound that seemed to echo across the continent. Outside, tens of thousands had gathered, not for the usual diplomatic ceremonies, but for something far more significant. The traitors, those once powerful men and women who had attempted to sell Africa's future for foreign influence, were now the spectacle. They were led through the streets, not in private vans or guarded convoys, but in front of a public that had long suffered their deceit. Faces once smooth with political swagger were now pale, covered with a mixture of shame and confusion. One by one, they were paraded before cameras, their names broadcasted across every news channel, every radio station, every social media feed. The world saw their faces, saw their cowardice. The officials tried to keep their heads down, but the eyes of the crowd, of the people they had betrayed, were unyielding. From Nairobi to Dakar, from Johannesburg to Cairo, their crimes were laid bare. The funds, the plans, the foreign complicity. They stood, silent and humiliated, as the cameras flashed. And then Mahamoud Ali Youssouf spoke. Standing before the mass of media and citizens, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence was command enough. His words, sharp and firm, pierced through the silence. "This is what happens when greed blinds us to the dignity of our people," he said, looking directly into the cameras. "This is what happens when we place foreign interests above the lives of our children, our farmers, our dreamers. Today, we are not just holding these men accountable. Today, we are reclaiming our birthright, dignity. This land, this continent, belongs to no one but us." The crowd erupted, the air thick with emotion. Chants filled the streets. "Africa is ours. Youssouf, the people's choice." Flags were waved. Tears were shed. For many, this wasn't just about exposing the traitors. It was about something much deeper, a reclaiming of identity, an awakening that had been long overdue. In cities, villages, towns, and districts far beyond the reach of cameras, people gathered, not in protest, but in celebration. Murals were painted on walls, depicting Youssouf as both a leader and a symbol of African pride. Songs were sung, echoing through the heart of the continent. There was a quiet pride, a collective sigh of relief. not just because Youssouf had thwarted a coup, but because he had ignited a flame that could no longer be put out. Across Africa, the message was clear. The winds of change had begun to blow, and they were sweeping through every corner of the continent. As the world watched the public exposure of the conspirators, Mahamoud Ali Youssouf knew that this victory was only the beginning of a much larger fight. He stood on the steps of the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, addressing not just the crowd gathered in front of him, but the entire continent. His message was direct and resolute. This was not merely a victory for Djibouti, but for every African nation that had long been subjected to the whims of foreign powers. Today, Youssouf began, his voice cutting through the air, we have shown the world that Djibouti is not for sale. But this victory is not just for us. It is for every nation that has suffered under the shadow of foreign influence. To Mali, to Burkina Faso, to Niger, to Sudan, and to every African country that has fought and continues to fight for sovereignty, we stand with you. Youssouf's words were not just a declaration of solidarity, they were a warning. He understood the global forces that had always worked behind the scenes, trying to destabilize African nations in order to control their resources and suppress their potential. We must remain vigilant, he continued. The enemies of our unity are not just beyond our borders, they are within them too. We have seen the betrayal of our own people. Let this be a reminder that the fight for our freedom is constant. The atmosphere was tense as Youssouf's call for unity rang out across the hall. This is our time to unite, he urged, not as individual nations but as one, united in purpose, in struggle, and in vision. Our future lies in shared security, economic independence, and mutual respect. If we allow ourselves to be divided, we are at risk of being manipulated. But if we stand together, no force, no power can break us. We will not be pawns in anyone's game. He paused, locking eyes with his audience, the weight of his words settling into the room. This is not just a political struggle, Youssouf declared. It is a fight for our survival, for our children's future, for Africa's future. We will rise and we will rise together. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices not just celebrating a leader, but the birth of a new Africa. An Africa that would no longer tolerate exploitation and division, but one that would stand as a united force on the global stage. With Youssouf leading the charge, Africa was no longer a passive observer. It was a rising power. From the ashes of betrayal, Djibouti, and Africa as a whole, began to rebuild. Under Mahamoud Ali Youssouf's leadership, the reforms that followed were as bold as they were necessary. The first major shift came in the form of a drastic reduction in foreign military presence. For years, Djibouti had been a strategic outpost for foreign powers, with multiple military bases dotting the coastline. But Youssouf had made it clear, no longer would the land serve as a playground for external interests. Over the following months, foreign troops began packing up, leaving behind an Africa that was learning to defend itself on its own terms. Economic reforms followed swiftly. Youssouf's government prioritized local industries, nationalizing key resources and redirecting them toward national development. No longer would African resources be shipped abroad, only to return as finished goods, enriching foreign companies and leaving local people impoverished. Djibouti's government worked closely with neighboring African nations to establish a regional trading bloc that could stand on its own, independent of Western powers. It was a new dawn for Africa's economic sovereignty, one that would resonate across the continent for generations to come. But it wasn't just the political and economic landscapes that shifted. Youssouf's cultural revolution began to take root in the hearts and minds of the people. Schools across Djibouti and beyond started teaching Pan-Africanism, with a renewed focus on African history, culture, and the shared struggle for independence. Children were taught not just the geography of their countries, but the interconnectedness of the African continent, its rich history, its struggles, and its undeniable potential. Murals of Youssouf began to appear on the walls of schools, government buildings, and even public squares. He was no longer just a leader. He had become a symbol. His image, alongside the symbols of African unity, adorned walls from Addis Ababa to Dakar, from Cairo to Cape Town. These murals told a story of pride, resilience, and a new Africa, rising above its past of exploitation. The African Union, once a body mired in bureaucracy, now became a symbol of real sovereignty. Its headquarters, once a place for diplomatic maneuvering and foreign influence, became the beating heart of an Africa that would no longer accept being dictated to. Under Youssouf's leadership, the AU had transformed into a force for the continent's true independence, its voice now echoing loudly on the global stage. Youssouf's legacy was not just the change he had brought to Djibouti. It was the seed he had planted across Africa, the spirit of unity and self-determination that would continue to grow long after he had passed. A seed buried deep in African soil does not die. It rises stronger. These were the words that echoed across the African continent as Mahamoud Ali Youssouf's legacy took root. Though the challenges ahead were formidable, from internal divisions to external pressures, the spirit of Africa had awakened. It was no longer a continent waiting for salvation from others, but one that would chart its own path forward. Youssouf had proven that even in the face of betrayal, even in the darkest moments, the will of the people could not be crushed. The path ahead would not be easy, but with unity, resilience, and a commitment to sovereignty, Africa's future was no longer in the hands of foreign powers. The final image of Youssouf standing tall before a sea of African flags said it all. The dawn of a new era had arrived, and it would not be dimmed.